My name is Marilyn Fair, and I'm the Executive Director and Legal Counsel to the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources.
My name is Dwight Williamson. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister with the Ecological Services Division with the Manitoba Department of Water Stewardship.
The governments themselves, the provincial governments, have said we own the water. I think, though, that that is one of the most difficult. That question hasn't been answered yet. First Nations say that the treaties never mentioned water.
So water in its natural state is a public good, belongs to all of the people of the country. There's no sort of buyer and seller of that water because it belongs to all of us.
The government firmly believes that they own all the water and there's no need for a discussion, and that First Nations firmly believe the opposite. They say their treaties, in fact, protected rights that they have, and that they still need to have a discussion about how to share water.
That is my understanding, that generally the government itself had taken ownership of land and water.
Most First Nations that I know don't want to buy or sell the water itself. Water is sacred. It's not something that you can really buy or sell because it moves. You can't even really own it, right? Yeah. The molecules move through the air and the water and the land, and so it's an idea almost, right? What you can do is share profits regarding providing a service of getting clean water to people.
Water is not something that could be taken apart and provided ownership to one community or one region or another. It was always a crown resource, so it was not subject to ownership and title in the same way that land was. And so water then in the Canadian Constitution was always a federal responsibility.
The courts have talked about this clause many, many times, and it sounds like what it meant was you can hunt, fish, and trap and do all the things you would normally do in the territory until we take it away from you, right? That's what it reads like, right? And the courts have said in some circumstances it might mean that, but in most circumstances it doesn't.
There were rights given to certain parcels of land and rights given as well to harvest and access to natural resources produced by both the land and the water. So the province of Ontario passed a law giving Winnipeg the right to obtain up to 100 million gallons per day out of Shoal Lake. And so that was without charge.
No, I don't think it's changed over time at all. The First Nation is trying to actually have an agreement be created, and now you can see that they're pushing really hard.
The federal government, through a Natural Resources Transfer Agreement and a Natural Resources Transfer Act put in place in the early 1930s, which basically provided, further clarified and provided the prairie provinces at least with further rights in water, as well as rights to manage the resources in those waters.
The province of Manitoba has a piece of legislation called the Water Rights Act, which states that Manitoba owns the property in and the rights to water. That's the language it uses.
First Nations believe that the federal government had no right to make that arrangement with the provinces on their behalf without consulting with them in the first place.
That's why I really am a proponent of watershed level planning, is what we call it, which is stepping back to the source of all the waters in the watershed and actually having all the citizens and the governments in that region make decisions about what would happen throughout the region, not just in their own backyard. Because if you keep making those decisions in isolation of one another, you get these problems. All the land in a province is owned by the province, except lands that are owned by the federal government. And so reserve lands are owned by the federal government in the language of the word owned. They are what's called legally, they are held in trust for First Nations.
There are differences between land and water that is recognized, and arising out of this were certain tracts of land which were provided to First Nations, and the First Nation then is essentially the owner of those lands.
It's very awkward though, because First Nations have constitutional level rights to those lands and waters as well within treaty territories. So we're really talking about two completely different ways of looking at land and water. In the Western way, we say ownership, like you can own it, and in the Indigenous way, ownership is a very new concept. In the previous, in traditional viewpoints, it's really about sharing with other species. Actually, it's not it's about having agreements with other Indigenous nations about who can use what and how, but it's the idea of owning and legally owning something is just not, we're talking two different languages. It's important, if you ever want to develop economically at all, you have to have water there because people are there. You have to extend water treatment facilities and sewage treatment facilities to the places you want to be economically developing, right? That's part of the underlying structure that has to be in place. And so Winnipeg realizes that it wants to expand its water availability for other purposes, for economic development. And the Shoal Lake is saying, you should not be expanding anything until we resolve our issue with you first.